My brother called me on a Tuesday, and something in his voice told me it was not a social call. He said everything was fine, that he was just checking in, that his back was bothering him a little. He laughed when he said it, that familiar low chuckle I had known my whole life. But Eddie Granger had not laughed like that since he was a young man. When we were kids and Eddie was nervous, he laughed. When our father caught him sneaking out past curfew, he laughed. When his first wife left him and he was trying not to cry in front of me, he laughed. I hung up the phone and started packing a bag. My name is Walter Granger. I am 64 years old, and I spent 31 years as a United States Marshal. I tracked fugitives across 22 states. I walked into places that sane men avoided and walked back out again, usually with someone in handcuffs. I retired 3 years ago to a small property outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, where I grow tomatoes badly and fish reasonably well. People who meet me now see a heavy-set man with a gray beard and reading glasses, and they assume I am someone's grandfather, which is fine. That assumption has served me well for most of my adult life. Eddie is my older brother by 5 years. He built Granger Home and Hardware from a single store in Dayton, Ohio, into a regional chain with 11 locations and a commercial division that contracts with half the construction companies in the state. He did it without a business degree, without investors, without anyone handing him anything. He did it with early mornings and stubbornness and a refusal to let anyone outwork him. He is the best man I have ever known. And when I pulled into his driveway on that Thursday afternoon and saw him standing on the porch in the middle of the afternoon in his bathrobe, I understood immediately that something had gone very wrong. He was thin. That was the first thing. Eddie had always been a broad-shouldered man, built like our father. Now his bathrobe hung off him like a coat on a fence post. He moved slowly, coming down the porch steps, and he stopped twice to catch his breath. And when he finally hugged me, I felt his ribs through the terry cloth. I told him he looked terrible. That was the only honest thing to say. He tried to laugh. What came out sounded like the memory of a laugh. He told me he had not been sleeping well. He told me his appetite was off since the heart scare 6 months ago. He told me his son-in-law Kyle had been handling the business and that everything was under control and that I should not have driven all the way up from Tennessee for nothing. He said all of this too quickly, standing in the driveway of his own home, glancing back at the house while he spoke, the way a man glances at a door when he is not sure who might be listening behind it. I asked him how his blood pressure medication was working. He said it was fine. I said his hands were shaking. He put them in his pockets. We stood there looking at each other. 30 years of reading people who were hiding something told me that my brother was terrified, and 31 years of brotherly love told me that he was not going to tell me why unless I stayed long enough to find out on my own. I picked up my bag and said I was staying for a few days. He said Kyle might not like that. I told Eddie that was interesting information. Kyle Ashford was 37 years old and had married Eddie's daughter Renee 4 years ago. He was tall, well-dressed, in the way that men are when they care more about appearing successful than being it, and he had the kind of confident handshake that I had seen on every two-bit con artist I had ever arrested. He arrived home at 6:30 that evening in a black Escalade that I was fairly certain belonged to the company. He stopped when he saw my truck in the driveway. He stood in the garage for a moment, recalibrating, before coming inside. He called me Walt and shook my hand and said it was great that I had come up for a visit. He said Eddie had been a little under the weather and could use some family around. He said all of this in the tone of a man managing a situation rather than greeting a person. Renee was quieter. She hugged me and said dinner was almost ready. She did not meet my eyes. We sat down to a dinner that the housekeeper had cooked, and Kyle put a plate in front of Eddie that had a piece of dry chicken breast and some steamed vegetables with nothing on them. No salt, no butter. He told Eddie that the cardiologist had been very specific about his diet, that they needed to take care of the old man's heart. He said, "Old man," with a smile that was not a smile. Eddie ate his dry chicken without complaint. I watched Kyle pour himself a generous glass of bourbon and describe his plans for the commercial division of Granger Home and Hardware. He called it his commercial division. He talked about restructuring, about new vendor relationships, about modernizing the inventory systems. He talked for 20 minutes without asking Eddie a single question. Renee nodded at everything he said. Eddie looked at his plate. After dinner, I helped Eddie to his room under the pretense of showing me some old photographs. I closed the door. I told him to tell me what was actually happening. He sat on the edge of the bed. For a long moment he was quiet. Then he told me. Kyle had moved into the house 8 months ago, right after Eddie's heart attack, saying it would be easier to help manage Eddie's recovery if he was on site. Within 3 months, Kyle had positioned himself as acting director of the commercial division. Within 5 months, he had changed the passwords on the company accounts and told Eddie it was for security purposes following a phishing attempt. Within 6 months, he had started bringing his own people into the management positions and pushing out the employees who had been with Eddie for years. The employees who asked questions found reasons to leave. The ones who stayed stopped bringing their questions to Eddie because they had learned that Eddie could not answer them anymore. 2 months ago, Eddie had tried to call his attorney to discuss the company bylaws. His phone had been replaced with a new one, and he had not been given the passcode. Kyle had said he would set it up when he had time. He had not had time yet. Last month, Eddie had tried to drive to the Dayton store himself. He had gone to the garage and found that the keys to his personal truck were not on the hook where they had always been. Kyle told him the truck needed brake work. The truck had not been in the shop. It was sitting in the lot behind the house with new brake pads that Eddie could see from his bathroom window. He told me this quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his voice the steady monotone of a man who has learned to keep the panic underneath. I asked him about his medication. I asked him very specifically about his blood pressure pills, because I had noticed him pressing his fingers to his temple twice during dinner, which was something our father used to do when his pressure was elevated. Eddie opened the nightstand drawer and handed me an orange prescription bottle. I read the label. The dosage was half of what his cardiologist had prescribed 18 months ago, according to the records Eddie still had in a folder in the back of his closet. Someone had obtained a new prescription at half strength without telling his doctor the old dosage. At reduced effectiveness, his blood pressure would stay elevated. An elevated blood pressure in a man who had recently had a cardiac event was not a coincidence. It was a slow and patient method of engineering a second heart attack. I sat with that information for a moment. Then I stood up and told Eddie to get some sleep, that I was going to figure some things out, and that he should not mention to Kyle or Renee what we had discussed. Eddie looked at me the way he had looked at me when we were young, and I had told him I would handle something. He looked relieved in a way that broke my heart, because my brother should not have needed me to handle anything in his own house. I sat in the guest room that night and thought it through carefully. In 31 years of federal service, I had learned that the difference between a man who gets away with something and a man who goes to prison is almost always documentation. Kyle was smart enough to have insulated himself with paperwork. Any confrontation without evidence was a conversation that Kyle would simply deny, and then make worse for Eddie afterward. I needed proof. To get proof, I needed access. And to get access without tipping Kyle off, I needed to be invisible. I went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror for a long time. Eddie and I had been mistaken for each other our entire adult lives. Same height, same build, same slope to the shoulders. His hair had gone gray before mine, but I was catching up. The difference people noticed first was my beard, which I had worn since leaving the Marshalls. The second difference was my energy. Eddie had always been the careful one, the measured one. I had always been the one who filled the room. If I shaved the beard and slowed myself down, I thought I could pass for Eddie at a distance. And in a city where his face was known to thousands of people but his son-in-law had only been around for 4 years, a distance was all I needed. The next morning, I told Eddie I had to drive back to Tennessee and that I would return in a few days. I told him exactly what I needed him to do before I got back. Then I drove to a Walmart, 3 towns over. I bought a beard trimmer. I bought the same style of reading glasses Eddie wore. I bought a light gray cardigan from the men's section that looked like something Eddie would own. I checked into a motel off the interstate and spent 45 minutes removing the beard I had grown since retirement. When I looked in the motel bathroom mirror, I saw my brother. But if you looked closely at the eyes, you would see something my brother did not have right now. You would see someone who was hunting. Eddie and I had agreed that he would take a short trip to visit an old friend in Columbus for a few days, a standing invitation he had been declining for months. His friend would not ask questions because Eddie would not explain, and Eddie was good at not explaining things. Kyle would be irritated but could not object without revealing that he needed Eddie present for reasons that had nothing to do with Eddie's well-being. I let myself into the house with the spare key I had made from Eddie's copy during my visit. I arrived at 7 in the morning, before Kyle came downstairs. The housekeeper, a woman named Gloria who had worked for Eddie for 11 years, found me in the kitchen making coffee and stared at me for a long moment before I showed her the photograph on my phone of Eddie and me at Christmas, standing side by side, and put my finger to my lips. Gloria was a woman who had spent 11 years watching out for Eddie Granger. She understood what I was doing faster than I could explain it. She nodded once, and from that moment she acted as though the man in the house was the man who had always been there. Kyle came downstairs at 8 and found me at the kitchen table with the newspaper. He stopped. Something crossed his face, a flicker of recalculation, before he smoothed it into the usual performance. He said I was up early. I said I slept better when I kept regular hours. He poured his coffee and told me that he needed me to sign some documents for the commercial division, that there was a vendor contract that required the owner's signature, and that it would be better if I just let him handle the details and signed where he indicated. He set a folder on the table next to my coffee cup. I opened the folder slowly. I flipped through the pages. I could not read everything quickly enough to assess it, but what I could see told me it was not a vendor contract. The language in the first 3 pages was the beginning of a transfer of operational authority, converting Eddie's ownership stake in the commercial division into a non-voting interest, while assigning directorial control to Kyle through a management company that I had never heard of. I closed the folder. I told Kyle I needed my reading glasses, that my eyes had been bothering me, and that I would look at it later. Kyle said it was time-sensitive. I said so were a lot of things at my age. He picked up the folder and left the kitchen without finishing his coffee. That afternoon, while Kyle was at the office, I went through the house carefully. I had done enough search work in my career to know what I was looking for and where people kept things. In the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in the home office, I found 18 months of bank statements for an account I did not recognize attached to the Granger Home and Hardware Commercial Division. The withdrawals were systematic and patient, never large enough individually to trigger automatic review flags, always routed through a vendor account belonging to an LLC called Pinnacle Resource Group. I ran the company name through a business registry database on my phone. Pinnacle Resource Group had been registered in Delaware 11 months ago. The registered agent was a law firm. The sole member was listed as a Kyle R. Ashford. Kyle was billing his own company for services that Granger Home and Hardware had never received, and he had been doing it for nearly a year. I photographed every page. That evening, Kyle came home in a dark mood. He barely spoke through dinner. Renee watched him the way people watch weather that might turn bad. When he poured his bourbon, he poured it heavy. I had spent the afternoon in the kitchen while Gloria cooked, and I had made a small adjustment to the bottle of antacid tablets on the kitchen counter, the ones Kyle took every evening because he had acid reflux, the ones that sat in the open because he used them after every meal. I had replaced the standard antacid tablets with magnesium citrate tablets I had purchased at the pharmacy, the kind that pharmacists politely describe as a bowel preparation. They were the same size and color as the antacids. Kyle shook 4 into his palm and washed them down with his bourbon without looking at them. The next morning, I was in the kitchen at 6:30 when Kyle came downstairs, moving very carefully. He was pale. His shirt was not tucked in. He told me he was not feeling well and that he had a breakfast meeting with the regional vice presidents of the commercial division, the men he had put in place to replace Eddie's people. I told him it was probably something he ate. He left anyway. I understood why. The meeting was not social. Kyle needed those men firmly aligned before the ownership transfer was complete. He could not afford to miss it. I learned later from Gloria, who had a cousin who cleaned offices downtown, that Kyle had excused himself from the conference room 6 times in 90 minutes, that the regional vice presidents had sat in silence between exits, looking at each other, that when Kyle had returned for the final time his jacket was inside out, that the meeting had ended without any decisions being made. I sat in Eddie's kitchen and drank my coffee and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like myself, but the satisfaction was brief, because I still had the pill bottle. I had found it in Kyle's nightstand during my search of the house, tucked behind a box of cufflinks. It was a prescription bottle with Eddie's name on it, from a pharmacy that was not the pharmacy Eddie used. The prescription inside was for a sedative, a mild one, but a sedative nonetheless. The dosage timing on the label matched Eddie's usual bedtime. Kyle had been adding a sedative to Eddie's evening medication. Not enough to be dangerous, just enough to make sure that an old man with a healing heart would sleep heavily, would be groggy in the mornings, would have difficulty concentrating, would seem, to outside observers, like a man whose mind was beginning to fail him. I sat with that for a long time. This was not just financial crime. This was a sustained and deliberate effort to destroy my brother's mind and body from the inside, to make the damage look natural, to make Eddie into the kind of man that no one would believe if he tried to speak up for himself. I called a retired colleague from the Marshals, a woman named Dana who had moved into private security consulting after her own retirement and who owed me a significant professional favor from 2009. I asked her to drive up from Cincinnati with 4 of her smallest cameras. She arrived the next afternoon while Kyle was at the office. We installed the cameras in 45 minutes. One in the living room mounted inside the housing of a smoke detector. One in the home office aimed at the filing cabinet. One in the kitchen covering the area where Kyle typically stood when he made his calls. One in the hallway. Dana connected them to a cloud server that only she and I could access from our phones. I told her to watch and record everything. She looked at the house, then at me. She said it was a very nice house for a man who was living like a prisoner in it. I said not for much longer. Kyle came home that night and found me sitting in the living room. He stood in the doorway and looked at me in a way that he had started looking at me since the morning after the breakfast meeting. A measuring look. He was not sure what had changed, but something had, and men like Kyle are sensitive to changes in their control over a situation. He sat down across from me. He told me he was concerned about my health. He said the doctors had mentioned that stress could be very damaging for someone in my condition. He said it very carefully, in the voice of a caring son-in-law. But what he was communicating was a threat. He was telling me to stop whatever I was doing and sign the papers. I told him I appreciated his concern. He said there was an elder law attorney he wanted me to meet, someone who could help structure things so I did not have to worry about the day-to-day decisions anymore. He said it would be a relief. I told him I had always enjoyed the day-to-day decisions. He stood up and said he was going to his office to make some calls. I told him to go right ahead. I pulled out my phone and opened Dana's app. The camera in the hallway outside the office showed Kyle pacing back and forth. He was on the phone. The audio was clear. He was talking to someone about a timeline. He said the old man was being difficult, that the documents were not signed, that he needed more time. The voice on the other end was not friendly. I recognized the tone from 30 years of listening to conversations that happened when men thought no one was recording them. It was the tone of someone to whom Kyle owed money, a debt that was not patient and not small. Kyle said he would have the transfer completed within the week. The voice said if he did not, there would be a conversation with Renee that Kyle would not enjoy. Kyle said he understood. I closed the app. I sat in the dark living room and understood the full picture now. The gambling debts that Dana had quietly confirmed through her own sources. The LLC that was bleeding the commercial division. The medication tampering, the isolation, the documents waiting to be signed. Kyle had built a very careful machine designed to turn my brother's life's work into a personal bailout, and he had timed it to complete before anyone on the outside could notice what was happening. He had not counted on a Tuesday phone call where my brother laughed wrong. The Granger Home and Hardware Annual Supplier Dinner was held every November at the Marriott downtown, a tradition Eddie had maintained for 22 years. It was attended by the company's major suppliers, regional managers, and commercial clients, approximately 300 people who represented the professional relationships Eddie had spent his career building. Kyle had announced, through the company's administrative assistant, that the dinner this year would include a formal address about the company's new strategic direction. He had not consulted Eddie. He had sent the invitations himself. I called Eddie in Columbus and told him to be at the Marriott at 7:15 on Friday evening. I told him to wear the charcoal suit, the one from the closet on the right side, not the newer one on the left. I told him to come in through the service entrance and wait for my call. I told him that when he walked into that ballroom, he should walk like he owned the place. He said he did own the place. I said I knew. That was the point. Dana had 2 of her people positioned in the venue by 6 o'clock. She was in the parking lot with a laptop connected to the cloud server. I arrived at 6:15 through the service entrance, having spent 40 minutes in the motel bathroom, removing all trace of the disguise, shaving the emerging beard back to clean skin, changing into a dark jacket that was mine, not Eddie's. I found a position at the back of the mezzanine level, overlooking the main floor of the ballroom. Below me, Kyle was working the room with the confidence of a man who had already won. He shook hands with the suppliers. He put his arm around the regional managers he had installed in place of Eddie's people. He stood at the center of every conversation, expansive and generous in the way that people are when they believe they are untouchable. Renee was at his side in a blue dress, smiling at people she recognized, not smiling at people she did not. She looked tired underneath the composure. She was a woman who had been making a calculation for a long time, and the calculation was beginning to show on her face. At 7 o'clock, Kyle stepped to the front of the room and took the microphone. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about the company's growth, about the future, about the importance of strong leadership in challenging times. He said that his father-in-law's recent health difficulties had made a leadership transition both necessary and overdue, and that tonight he was honored to announce the formal reorganization of the commercial division under new management. He said Eddie's name with the practiced sadness of a man performing grief for an audience. I picked up my phone. I sent a text to Dana. The screen at the front of the room, the one that had been displaying the company's logo, flickered. Kyle glanced at it. He kept talking. The screen flickered again, and then it resolved into a crisp, clear image from the camera in the home office. The timestamp in the corner read 3 days ago, 11:17 in the evening. The room went quiet. Kyle was visible on the screen, standing at the filing cabinet, photographing documents with his phone. The audio was clean. He was on a call while he did it, and the voice on the other end of the call was asking him how long before the transfer was complete, and Kyle was saying soon, that the old man was confused and signing things he did not read, that by the time anyone noticed, the commercial division would be restructured in a way that was very difficult to untangle. The camera then switched to the kitchen from 2 mornings ago. Kyle standing at the counter with Eddie's prescription bottle, removing tablets and replacing them with others from a separate bottle he carried in his jacket pocket. The room had stopped breathing. Kyle turned to look at the screen. I watched his face from the mezzanine. The performance fell off it the way a mask falls when someone stops holding it up. What was underneath was something much smaller than he presented to the world. He told the room it was fabricated. He said it was edited. He said his father-in-law had become paranoid in his illness and had been making accusations. He said this very quickly, in a voice that had lost all its warmth. Renee was looking at the screen. She was no longer smiling. She was looking at her husband with an expression I recognized from years of interviews, the expression of someone who has suspected something for a long time and is watching it be confirmed. Her hand went to her mouth. She took a step away from him without seeming to realize she was doing it. I checked my phone. Eddie had confirmed he was at the service entrance. I walked down from the mezzanine, through the side corridor, and pushed open the door to the main floor of the ballroom at the back. The crowd turned at the sound of the door. Kyle turned with them. He saw me standing in the doorway, and the confusion on his face was complete. He had last seen what he thought was Eddie in this building 2 hours ago, overseeing the arrangement of the tables. He had believed the old man was home, confused, safely out of the way. I walked forward. I did not move like an old man with a healing heart. I moved like what I was. I said hello to Kyle. He said I was not supposed to be there. He said it like that, precisely, revealing that there was a version of events in which my presence was a violation of something planned. I said that was an interesting way to welcome family. I told the room my name. I told them I was Eddie Granger's brother, that I had spent 31 years with the United States Marshals, and that what they had seen on the screen was from cameras that had been installed legally on private property owned by my brother, and that every recording had already been shared with the Franklin County District Attorney's Office and the Ohio Attorney General's Office, along with documentation of a pattern of financial fraud, medication tampering, and coercion. Kyle looked around the room. The suppliers and managers and clients who had been listening to him speak about the future of their professional relationships were looking at him with expressions that ranged from confusion to disgust to the cold calculation of people who were already thinking about contract clauses. He looked at Renee. She had moved fully away from him now and was standing with her arms crossed, crying quietly, not at him but at something she had decided before this moment. Kyle moved toward the side exit. He made it 4 steps before Dana's 2 people stepped into the gap. They were not large people, but they carried themselves in a particular way that stopped Kyle as effectively as a wall. I told Kyle that the police were approximately 6 minutes away, and that he was welcome to use the time however he chose. He chose to stand very still and stare at the floor. The back doors of the ballroom opened at 7:20. The room turned again. Eddie Granger walked in wearing the charcoal suit and carrying the posture of a man who had built something from nothing and intended to keep it. He walked down the center of the room, and the people who knew him, the ones who had worked with him for years, began to stand, not in a formal way, just in the way that people rise when someone they have been missing finally comes through the door. Kyle looked up when he heard the footsteps. He looked at Eddie. He looked at me. He looked at Eddie again. The realization moved across his face like a slow tide. He said something very quietly that I will not repeat here. I said it was a reasonable response to the situation. The police arrived in 5 minutes rather than 6. I walked outside with the lead detective and handed over a folded envelope containing a USB drive with the full recordings, the photographed financial documents, the prescription analysis that a pharmacist friend of Dana's had quietly confirmed, and a 4-page summary I had typed out in the motel room 2 nights ago, organized the way I had learned to organize case files over 3 decades. The detective looked at the envelope and then at me. I told him I used to work for the government. He said he could tell. Kyle was arrested in the lobby. He did not make a scene. Men who have spent years as the most intimidating person in their environment tend to become very quiet when they encounter a system that is not frightened of them. He walked to the police car looking at the pavement, which was the appropriate place for him to look. Renee stood on the sidewalk outside the hotel and watched the car pull away. I stood beside her, not speaking, while she put the last several years together in whatever private accounting she was doing. After a while, she said that she had known something was wrong for a long time. She said she had told herself it was not as bad as she thought. She said she had chosen the version of events that was easier to live in. I said that people did that. She said she did not know how to apologize to her father. I said she could start by telling him the truth, all of it, without asking him to make her feel better about it. I said Eddie was a man who had forgiven people for things that did not deserve forgiveness, but that the forgiveness would mean more if she stopped needing it to come easily. She said that was fair. I said it was. She went back inside to find her father. I sat down on a bench outside the hotel and looked at the parking lot, at the line of cars, at the ordinary Friday night world continuing around a moment that had felt very large from the inside. 3 years of retirement had softened the edges of who I had been for most of my adult life. This week had reminded me that the edges were still there. I was not sure how I felt about that. My phone buzzed. It was Dana. She said everything was transmitted, backed up, and confirmed, received by the DA's office. She said it had been a pleasure working with me again. She said she had missed this. I said I had too, a little. She laughed and hung up. I drove to the motel, packed my bag, and checked out. Then I drove to the house. I parked in the driveway. I sat in the truck for a moment looking at the lights in the windows. The house that my brother had built his life inside, that had been slowly converted into a place where he was afraid. I went inside. Gloria was in the kitchen. She handed me a cup of coffee without being asked. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had read the newspaper 4 days ago wearing my brother's cardigan and my brother's posture, doing my brother's best impression of a man who was not planning anything. Eddie came home an hour later. He came in through the back door and stood in the kitchen doorway. He was still wearing the charcoal suit. He looked like himself, the real version, the one who had been missing since before the heart attack. He sat down across from me. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said that when he walked into that ballroom and saw 300 people turn to look at him, he had felt, for the first time in months, like a person who was still present in his own life. I said that was all I had been trying to give him back. He said I had given him more than that. We drank our coffee in the kitchen of his house, and the house was quiet in the right way, the way of a place that has been reclaimed, and it was enough just to sit there. Two old men, brothers, in the particular peace that comes after a fight that needed to be fought. Kyle Ashford entered a guilty plea 7 months later on 3 counts of financial fraud, 1 count of elder abuse, and 1 count of unlawful administration of a controlled substance. The unlawful administration charge carried a sentence by itself that would keep him occupied for some years. The financial fraud added more. His attorney argued that Kyle had been under extreme financial pressure, which was true, and that the pressure had led to poor decisions, which was an interesting way to describe what he had done to my brother. The Pinnacle Resource Group was dissolved. The money that could be recovered was recovered. The commercial division went back under Eddie's operational control, and the first thing Eddie did was call every regional manager Kyle had installed and tell them their positions were being evaluated and that the evaluation would be completed by the people who had been doing those jobs before Kyle arrived and had been pushed out, and that the former employees were welcome to return if they chose to. Most of them chose to return. The following spring, I came back up to Ohio for a week and helped Eddie build a raised garden bed in the backyard. He wanted to grow tomatoes. I told him what I knew about growing tomatoes, which was not much, but we built the frame together over 2 days, and on the 3rd day we drove to a nursery and bought seedlings, and Eddie crouched down in the dirt to put the first one in the ground. And he looked up at me from the garden bed with mud on his hands and said that he was not going to thank me again because he had already thanked me enough. I told him that was a relief because the thanks were getting embarrassing. He laughed. It was the right laugh, the real one, the one I had been missing since that Tuesday phone call. I drove home to Tennessee at the end of the week. I grew my beard back on the way. Some people look at a 64-year-old man and see someone whose best years are behind him. Someone who can be managed and handled and quietly moved aside. I understand why they think that. The reading glasses help. So does the garden. But 31 years is a long education in how the world actually works. And the most important lesson is one that the worst people never seem to learn in time. The man who appears to have given up is not always the man who has given up. Sometimes he is just waiting for the right moment to remind you of exactly who you are dealing with. My name is Walter Granger. I am 64 years old, and if someone in your life is being treated the way my brother was treated, do not wait for a Tuesday phone call. Pick up your own phone, drive, show up. The people who love us are sometimes too afraid to say how much they need us, and that is precisely when we need to show up anyway. That is what family is for. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. We will see you in the next one.